back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we talk about the issues impacting our Black and Brown communities. My name is Michelle Jacobs, and I'm here as always with my co-host Ray Small. So Ray, how you doing?
I am hanging in there. I'm hanging in there, and I'm excited about this episode.
Yeah, so we've been talking all season about trying to do a show about genealogy and the issue of slave wrecks and how do we recover our history. And now that we have interference from the government with the Smithsonian African American Museum, it's really important that our listeners understand what is involved in recovering our history and how to go forward with it. So what do you have lined up for us today in that respect?
Well, Michelle, with that in mind, I think we found the exact perfect person to have this discussion with. And his name is Kamal Siddiqui. He is a member of the board of directors and lead instructor with Diving with a Purpose, DWP, an organization committed to resurrecting the stories of shipwrecks involved in what's been termed over the decades as the Middle Passage, but which he refers to as the transatlantic era of African enslavement. And he does it through underwater archaeological documentation. He is also a dive master certified by the Professional Association of Dive Instructors and is certified by NOAA, otherwise known as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and as well the National Association of Black Scuba Divers Foundation, and they do scientific research for the National Park Service. Kamal worked actively on the search for and underwater documentation of 6 transatlantic era of African enslavement shipwrecks, including the São José off the coast of South Africa, the Guerrero discovered in southern Florida, and the Clotilda located near Mobile, Alabama. The Clotilda was the last ship to bring captured Africans into the U.S. with the intent to enslave them. Some of their descendants live in Africatown near Mobile. Kamal and the people of the town are heavily featured in the film Descendant, which tells the story of the Clotilda and efforts of the members of Africatown to preserve their history. In November of 2023, Kamal was inducted into the National Association of Black Scuba Divers Hall of Fame, and he was recognized as the 2016 National Association of Black Scuba Divers Diver of the Year, and received the Underwater Adventure Seekers 2016 Founders Award by NAB's co-founder and International Diving Hall of Fame inductee, Dr. Albert Jose Jones. And Michelle, even with his crazy busy schedule, he's a certified Jivana yoga instructor, believe it or not, and a licensed general aviation pilot. So he's in the water and he's up in the sky at the same time. And he also enjoys kayaking and playing the djembe drums. He is a proud father of 2 adult children and a recent first-time grandfather. So Kamal, welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. It's quite a pleasure to be on your podcast.
The pleasure is ours, believe me. So let's get started. It is really, really unusual, and I'm a person who loves the water, and I love being in the water, but I've never learned how to scuba dive, and you are a master diver. So before we talk about wrecked slave ships and our history, would you give our audience a little bit more about what the National Association of Black Scuba Divers is all about, as well as Diving with a Purpose?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that could be a podcast within itself, Raymond. Yeah, those are 2 incredible organizations. The first one, National Association of Black Scuba Divers, which I'm a past president. It was founded by 2 incredible gentlemen, Rick Powell, who was a Navy diver. They founded back in 1991. But the second gentleman, Dr. Albert Jose Jones, an incredible individual. He's still with us well into his 90s, but he started scuba diving back in 1951. Wow. As a Black man diving in that period of time. He was joined the Army. He was a Army diver. And then he had to deal with all sort of stuff you can imagine back in the 50s, being Black and diving. which a sport even today is considered exclusively, a white activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, so he said, well, enough of that. I'm going to establish my own dive club. So in 1959, he established a black scuba diving club here in Washington, D.C., called the Underwater Adventure Seekers. And we just celebrated our 65th anniversary last year. And we're still going very, very strong. Well,
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, that's great.
yeah. He's an incredible individual. And so he's the one that got me into scuba diving. He's the one that certified me as a scuba diver. There's a story there. I'll just go into it just a little bit. I'm a retired engineer, and so I was managing a huge program here in Washington for the Army Corps of Engineers, the hydropower program. So I was traveling all over the country, and I was coming back through the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. And when I got to the gate to come back to Washington, D.C., this elderly gentleman was sitting there. He must have been coming back from the Galapagos or someplace because he was just totally exhausted, nodding out, going in and out of sleep. But on that particular trip, Raymond, Michelle, I took a book to read with me called The Henrietta Marie. The Henrietta Marie was a British vessel of enslavement
Mm-hmm.
that sank off the coast of Key West. And so I read that story. It was called Spirit Dive, written by Michael Copman. And so anyway, I got to my gate, and I saw this gentleman sitting there. And so what I noticed about him, he had all these dive patches all over his jacket. And so when I got close enough to him, I noticed one on his left shoulder said the Henrietta Marie. I said, wow, what a coincidence.
Mm.
When he came out of his nut, I struck up a conversation with him, and very gracious gentleman about scuba diving. He talked to about all his diving adventures, and um, he said, Kamal, are you interested in scuba diving? I said, yeah, I've thought about it. He said, well, your timing couldn't be any better. We start our training next week. And
Wow.
so, yeah, he trained me how to scuba dive, and right here in Dunbar High School here in Washington, D.C. They had a swimming pool there, and they took me out to the open ocean for my first dive. Again, he's an incredible gentleman. Netflix actually has just finished a movie, a documentary on his life and legacy called The Black Godfather of Scuba Diving. It might be streaming now. I'm not sure, but you can. I think there's a site on the web that's streaming it as well. It's called The Black Godfather of Scuba Diving:
Okay.
The Diving Legacy of Dr. Albert Jose Jones, something like that for the subtitle. But yeah, he he is the only African American that's been inducted into the International Divers Hall of Fame. And so him and Rick Powell, they founded NABS, to get back to the original question, in 1991. And so we have clubs and organizations. It's actually an international organization. We have a lot of clubs in cities across the U.S. and a few in cities uh, in other parts of the world. And so we are divers who look after each other. Now we train other African Americans how to dive, and our key operating principle is that we look after each other. We're concerned for their safety. We're concerned for their learning skills and using proper techniques when scuba diving. So wherever we go in the world, we see a NAB diver, we're going to say, that's my buddy. That's my dive buddy.
Mm.
Or we take care of each other. Diving with a Purpose. Diving with a Purpose was founded by Ken Stewart and this archaeologist down in National Biscayne Park in Florida, in the Florida Keys in Biscayne, Florida. Brenda Lasendorf. She was an archaeologist at the National Park Service, Biscayne National Park. And Ken Stewart just happened to be down there about 20 some odd years ago. And he was having this conversation with her about the shipwrecks that was in the national park down there off the coast of near Largo, but near Homestead, Florida. And she said, I have a lot of wrecks down here, and the Senate just passed a bill called the National Maritime Heritage Act, and they told me I have to investigate all these shipwrecks that's in my footprint down here. I'm the only diver down here. I'm the only archaeologist in the park. How can I do this? And Ken told her, well, we have divers and we can help out. And so Ken
Mm.
left that meeting and went back to NABS the National Association of Black Scuba Divers sent email out to all the members, said, "Are you all tired of looking at pretty fish and gorgeous reefs and stuff?" And he added, "Do you want to dive with the purpose?" And I said, yeah, let's do that. So around 2004 or so, the first group went out to do this work, and that was the beginning, of diving with the purpose. And so now we know at some point that, we're going to have to hang up our fins, and we're training. We got a very powerful youth program where we're teaching young people how to do this work as well,
Hmm.
not only on shipwrecks, but also appreciating the marine environment and restoring, at least trying to address the impact and deterioration of our coral reef systems, which we are very dependent on.
Hmm.
Second breath we take come from those coral reef systems. So we're trying to raise youth awareness and let the next generation know that we have to stay engaged with the oceans, with the water. And so through our CARES program, we call it CARES, Collective Approach to Restoring Our Ecosystem. We're training young people how to do this work.
That's so critical to especially our community because,
Yes.
over the decades, we have just not been friendly or simpatico with water. For whatever reason, I have so many friends, even members of my family, have never learned how to swim, much less explored anything beyond that. And as a matter of fact, the movie Descendant showed you working with a group of young kids from that Alabama area and giving them their first diving lessons. What was that like? What was that experience like? And then I'll get on to the next question I have for you.
Sure, yeah. That's it's. I think it's very critical, Raymond, Michelle, for us to really engage young people and teach them to break this stereotype. It's important for us to break this stereotype of our fear of the water. Their very life depends on it. If you look at the data from CDC and other sources, who is leading the statistics in drowning within our young age groups, teenagers
Mm,
and young
mm,
adults? We are,
mm,
simply because we haven't learned a simple basic skill like swimming. Where if you look at the history, if you look at the historical data, African people were doing freestyle swimming long before any other people in the world. I reference you to a good book called The Undercurrents of Power, The Aquatic Adventures of in the African Diaspora by Kevin Dawson out of
mm.
the University of Mesquite in California. He shows very clearly that when European colonists went into Africa, who the crew people in Liberia, they were swimming across the river doing deep diving for pearls and clams and so forth and so on. Whereas in Europe and other places, they was basically doing dog paddle. So this fear of the water we has been perpetuated on us, the stereotype, mainly because of the global system of white supremacy,
Mm.
not having access to adequate swimming facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, that's a powerful moment in the film, actually,
Yes.
when they show you teaching the kids how to jump into the water. And it resonated so much with me because I cannot swim. And my kids are like fish, and whenever we're traveling in Africa, they're like, well, what if the boat or something springs a leak and we go down? I'm like, I'm gonna die.
we don't want that to
And
happen.
my
We don't
answer
want that
is,
to happen.
so to see you working with those kids and trying to get them to not be afraid of the water was
Yes.
just wonderful. And it was one of the moments in the film where I actually teared up because I was like,
Hmm.
this is such important work.
Yep.
And you could tell the joy that you were having in showing them how to survive and how to love and how to function in the water. It was wonderful.
Hmm.
Sure, yeah, it was what was feeding my joy was the joy and excitement on those young people's faces. We had one young man that as soon as we put the equipment on him, he wanted to put the regulator in his mouth, went down, heading toward the deep end. So we had to slow him down a bit. So it was an exciting moment. And so that program is still underway, the Africa Town Swim to Scuba program, and we're still working with them down there to bring more young people to the water.
Kamal, we mentioned the movie Descendant several times already, and that movie, so much of it was based upon the wreck of the ship, the Clotilda. and the wreck that
Hmm.
is mostly associated with other wrecked slave ships, throughout history. Do you have any idea how many ships are out in the waters and how important it is that as many ships as possible be located and identified? And the idea is the slave ships that were coming over, the 12,000 or so that made those transatlantic or transoceanic voyages.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be glad to address that, Raymond. But I think it's critically important for me to just add this sort of preface, if you will. In doing this work, what we're trying to do is deconstruct rather, and decolonize the whole thinking around us as a people, this work in archaeology, etc. And so as we do that, it's imperative that we not use the same language that got us in this situation. Because if we do, it just perpetuates and it works against our work that we're trying to do. So one thing that I'm very passionate about, and I try very cognitively and consciously not to use the word, quote, slave, because every time we use that word, it diminishes us, it
Mm-hmm.
dehumanizes us. It was used to dehumanize us.
Mm-hmm.
I say very clearly that our ancestors were never slaves. They were enslaved. It was not the identity which the world want to kind of force on us that you were a slave, etc., etc. No, no, it was a condition that was enforced on us. So I don't refer to the so-called transatlantic slave trade. I call it the transatlantic era of African enslavement, and actually the transoceanic era of African enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
There was activity in the Atlantic Ocean as well. So with that, to try to address your question about these vessels, yes, there was some 12,000 vessels involved in the trade. They made some 40,000 voyages across the Atlantic, bringing from Africa some, academics would say about 12.4, but that's conservative. I believe that's conservative. It's something in the area of 15 to 20 million African people over a 250-year period. Huge drain on the continent of Africa, particularly West Africa. And you can only imagine the impact of losing generation after generation after generation of young people, particularly just ripped away and brought to another part of the world without, being able to practice their culture, stay connected with their own ancestors, their own family, etc., etc. So that's a huge human impact. And so these people constantly, Raymond, Michelle, one thing that was always constant on their mind was to return home. And we see that in the survivors of the Clotilda as well. But more importantly, we have to keep in our minds that, our ancestors always resisted enslavement. They
Right.
constantly, every day, resisted enslavement. And what was upmost on their minds was to reclaim their dignity, to reclaim their humanity, that we are a human being. And that was the essence of their struggle. And we're still struggling to do that today because the trauma of that experience is still with us today. That
Mm-hmm.
epigenetic trauma is still with us today. And so you mentioned the Clotilda. I can talk for a while about the Clotilda. I was involved in the work to archaeologically document that vessel. Just real briefly, I encourage your listeners to check out the film Descendant and even Google Clotilda to get some more background information to save some time here. But it was the last vessel that brought enslaved people into the U.S. to an attempt to enslave them in 1860, on July 7th, 1860, against the will of so-called law of the land. Those Captain Timothy William Foster and Timothy Meagher, who was the perpetrators, they supposed to have been executed because that was the law for previous since 1820 when the U.S. passed the Piracy Act. So if you import people into the U.S. to intend to enslave them, the punishment is death, execution. But over that 40 to 50-year period, only one individual was executed, Nathaniel Gordon, and it was done out of political expediency in 1862. And we have to put it in the time context of what was happening in 1862, right? Yeah, Abraham Lincoln signed the execution order, but again, we was in the midst of the Civil War, and we can talk about that some other time. But in 1860, they brought the Clotilda descendants into the U.S., tried to enslave them. They did enslave them for a short period of time. The war happened, and after the war, of course, they were so-called emancipated. They had nowhere to go, no resources, ripped from their homeland, without any connectivity with their family or their culture. And so they approached Timothy Mear to give them land so they can start a new life here. And Timothy Mear said, "You crazy? I brought you here to enslave you." And so anyway, they was very resourceful. They even went to work with for Timothy Mear in his lumber mills. They saved up their money and they bought land from him, individual that enslaved them, and established a community down there called Africatown. It is the only community that I know of in the U.S. that was founded by African people from
Mm,
Africa that was brought here with the intent to enslave them. So it
mm,
still
mm,
exists. But again, since 1867 to today, you can imagine the tremendous racist impacts that the community had to deal with, both environmental racism, economic racism, cultural racism, etc. And actually, they got it from both sides, but mainly from the whole system of white supremacy. Black folk, because of our lack of knowledge, in some case ignorance, called in those, these wild Africans over there in Africatown, and white folks just blatantly racist in terms of putting these factories right in the middle of their communities over time.
mhm,
These wooden these lumber yards, these petroleum factories. As a matter of fact, the state of Alabama ran a road right down the middle of Africatown, almost destroyed it. But because of their resilience, they're still there. So in 2018, there was a news reporter who thought he had found the Clotilda, and it made a lot of noise. And eventually, the people of Africatown began to call it the No-Tilda because it ended up not being the Clotilda. So they called us in, us being Jim Delgado, who was the lead investigator, archaeologist in the Smithsonian, to go down and do a detailed investigation. Uh, they being the Alabama Historical Commission, who had the rights of the waters there. And we did an extensive survey along the river, and we came up with several possibilities. We narrowed it down to three. We focused on those three and came up with one. And one of those were the Clotilda. And we went back to the community before we said anything to anybody else, went back to Africatown, told those descendants that we found a vessel that their ancestors came over on. And man, that was a very powerful moment to say the least. In May of 2022, we went back and did an extensive archaeological survey. We extracted some 94 artifacts from the wreck, and we don't like to do that, by the way. We like to leave material, what we call in situ, as it lie. The power of place is where we can tell the most powerful story, right? But we took out 94, we put 90 of them back. We thought four of them were so significant that we need to conserve them to help tell the story. Excuse me. And so a couple of the pieces are in conservation now. They're being conserved. So we can add them to the museum that was opened down there in July of 23 to help tell the story. And at this point, Raymond, if you don't mind, I'll just add that yes, we have to do the archaeology. We have to do the science. We have to study. We have to cut, probe, conserve, measure, evaluate, and so forth. But in terms of colonial archaeology, that's a whole nother dimension that has been missed. And I call it for a spiritual dimension, if you will, because the essence of our ancestors are embedded in this materiality, in these artifacts, right? We know it's there. They touched it. They suffered. They experienced horrible conditions in these vessels. So their essence is embedded in these artifacts. And I had the humble privilege of dealing with 6 of the 15 of the 20 of the 12,000 ships that was engaged. We only know about 15. And I've had the humbling experience to deal with 6 of those vessels, and Clotilda being one of them. And so on this last excavation field mission, we dove on the Clotilda, and it is the only, I might add, it is the only vessel of those 12,000s where you can actually see an outline of a ship All the other wrecks that we know, the 15 or so that we know, are scattered across a wrecking landscape. But here we have an actual ship, which makes it extremely valuable. Not only that, Michelle, Raymond, the
Mm.
actual cargo hold that the 110 people were in to cross the Atlantic still exists. So
It
they're
was intact. When you discovered
intact.
it was intact.
It's still intact. It's still there. Nothing like that exists in the archaeological record or the historical record, which makes this vessel very, very important. And so I had the opportunity to dive into that space. And I'll just take a moment here to describe what that was like, because another vessel we found off the coast of South Africa, the South Jose, back in 2013 was my first experience of interacting with any material from any vessel of enslavement, a so-called slave shipwreck. And I remember very distinctly during that experience that I swam up to this piece of wood and I reached out and grabbed it. And as soon as I touched it, I could sense the horror and heard the screams and the hollers of the 212 individuals that went down in that wreck.
Mm.
It was very real to me, very palatable. I could feel it, right? And so we treat these sites as sacred sites. And so we did a little ritual to honor them and went back to Makua village and told them that we found their ancestors and had given us some soil to place on that particular site. So I knew that diving into that cargo hold of the Clotilda was going to be a very powerful moment. A dear friend of mine, Sabrina Johnson, said, Kamal, if you're going to dive into that hole, you need to find some way to acknowledge those ancestors, to speak to them, to listen to their voices, because they are speaking to us from these vessels. They are. And we have to know how to listen. You know, we can't listen with our ears, right? Because they're not going to be speaking in Spanish or Portuguese or English.
Hmm.
How to listen with our hearts,
Mm.
for our hearts and stay connected with them. So she worked on a prayer that she and I sort of composed. And if you don't mind, I want to share that with you. We call it the Ancestral Prayer for the Clotilda First Dive, my very first dive on the Clotilda, reviving the spirits of those who traveled on the Clotilda. And it goes, Beloved ancestors, your voices have been quiet for 162 years, but your silence ends now. Your voices and memory are lifted now from this wretched vessel through us, and we welcome you to speak through us. Our connection will never be broken. We are because of you. Thank you for reaching out to us. Blessings to your spirit always.
Kamal, when I saw you do the prayer in the film, it was just yet another powerful moment. Anyone who doesn't watch that film, Descendants, there's something wrong with. There's so many powerful moments in the film, including that one where you're calling out to the ancestors. And for folks who do genealogy work, a lot of times when we're in the midst of the work, we tell people that our ancestors are speaking to us. And they always look at us like we're crazy. Like, what do you mean they're speaking to you? But when you're in the work, they do speak to you, they drive you, they push you in a direction that will help you uncover their story because they want to be discovered. They want their stories to be told.
Hmm.
And that was such an emotional and powerful moment in the film when you're doing the prayer. And it leads me to ask you this question too. You said that you work with the descendant community whenever you find a wreck because you want them to be involved in what's happening and to be informed about what their ancestors were experiencing. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What's the what's the emotional piece to that, and how is it difficult to work with the descendant groups, or how do they respond to some of the stuff that you're trying to tell them?
No, actually, quite the opposite, because they want to know. They want to know what happened to their ancestors. They want to know what they experienced. And you can't get any closer than having the actual materiality, the actual shipwreck that their ancestors came over on. And so they was very anxious to know more, to work with us, to engage with us, and wanted to know, what our experience was like, engage in this materiality and what can we do, to help. We don't just, come in as archaeologists, archaeology advocates, and descend on these wrecks, study it, cut up, measure, evaluate, write a report, and we gone. No, no, it's very important for us to do outreach and stay connected to the community and take directions from them. If they say this should not be done out of respect, we won't do it, you know. So we are integrating it as part of the anthropological process when you're doing this work, that you have to engage the community that particular wreck impacted the most. And there's several wrecks that have these descendant communities um, and that's still in existence now, and that we have to engage with, because no ancestor wants to be forgotten, right? And if you forget your ancestors, your descendants will forget you. And so we make it a point to stay connected with that descendant community as we go along and do the work, keep them updated and posted. Sometimes it get very emotional. Um, Matter of fact, we was in Liberia back in December, um, talking to a descendant community there that was on the very first vessel that got Diving with a Purpose started, the Guerrero. Some of those descendants was repatriated to Liberia. And I just remember was sitting in this hotel interviewing one of the descendants. He was a lawyer, very professional man. And he had just a small piece of information that is his grandfather used to talk about, that they came from this particular community in Florida. And we went and told him exactly where that community was, but he never knew. And he just broke down and cried like a baby. So just to have that information, that knowledge, to be reconnected, to be whole again, because if you're disconnected from your ancestors, you're misguided, trying to balance yourself on one leg without having the support of your ancestral knowledge. So it's very important in doing this work, again, to stay connected to the descendant community.
That is really powerful. Let me just ask you too, we heard you speak about, and it's probably subsumed in what you've already been saying, but we heard you speak about a principle called Ma'afa,
Hmm.
if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Sure.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So as I said earlier, it's critically important for us to decolonize the language that we use as well. Um, and so what has happened to people of African descent through this transatlantic era of African enslavement was a horrific, horrible human occurrence. You know, the largest forced importation of people in human history. That's unprecedented. And so it's a horrible occurrence. And so the key Swahili term for a great disaster, a horrible occurrence is called Maafa, Maafa. So it's a horrible occurrence. Um, it's much more than I don't want to compare tragedies, but some other group has monopolized the word Holocaust. And so for us, it is Maafa. It's a
Hmm.
great Maafa that occurred to us. And we have to understand that as such within our own cultural context that give us agency. So uh, it was a term actually that was used, I think, first by Marimba Ani, Professor Marimba Ani, who was a professor of history and anthropology, I believe, at Hunter College in New York. She wrote a book called Yurugu, and she used that term Maafa to describe this great disaster that has happened to us.
Yeah, no, the whole decolonizing language is so very important.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because we need to tell our stories in our own language, not colored or filtered by the language of the colonial group. So we really appreciate that, and we'll try to make sure we use that term
Absolutely.
going forward.
We're all storytellers, and I just got back from South Africa working with some young folks down there, and this incredible gentleman has a group called NOOF, Nature, Environment, Wildlife Filmmakers. So he brings in young people from all over the continent of Africa to South Africa and teach them how to do film to tell our stories using film. It
Hmm.
could be about wildlife, it could be about the community, it could be about whatever proposal they can put it together.
Hmm.
And he used the term, said that if we want to change the story, we have to change the storytellers.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know,
Absolutely.
we're the ones that's got have to tell our stories using the language that is appropriate within the culture, our own cultural context. So,
So, Kamal, you and your group, Diving with a Purpose, haven't just been involved with locating slave shipwrecks. You've also discovered when you guys were called to the state of Michigan, Lake Huron, you also discovered wrecks of former Tuskegee Airmen. Can you tell our audience about how that happened and what were those discoveries like?
sure, yeah, yeah. Just to clarify a little bit, Raymond, we didn't quote discover it. There was an accident up there, a tugboat accident up there, and so the county sheriff was out doing a survey trying to find this wreck, and he ran across a door. He thought it was a door from an automobile, but it's actually a door from this P-39 aircraft that the Tuskegee Airmen was training on. So they called in the state archaeologist, Wayne Lasorte, and he looked at it and said, "Wow, we got something here." And so he contacted us to come up to help investigate. He contacted Diving with the Purpose to come up and help investigate the wreck. So we went up, and it was in August of 2015, I believe. We went up and documented that wreck. It's an incredible story. Uh, Lieutenant Moody, who was a Howard University graduate, trained in Tuskegee, and he was training in the Great Lakes flying a P-39 Cobra, it's called. It's aircraft, not unusual aircraft actually, because the engine is behind the pilot. It's not in front of it. And it had these big caliber machine guns on the wings and shooting through the nose of the airplane.
Hmm.
So he was doing live fire training, flying about 300 miles an hour, about 100 feet off the lake. And
If I
then
can
all of a sudden,
interrupt, come out. What now? Why would they be training on a lake? Give us the reasons why Tuskegee Airmen went from where their base was at up to the northern part of the country in order to train at Lake Huron.
sure, yeah, the Army Air Corps had a base up there called Stillwell, not Stillwell, I forgot the name of the base on the lake there. So the very reason that it was training up there, Raymond, they thought that was the U.S. Army thought that that environment was very similar in some ways to the Mediterranean environment, and that's where they was going to be operating most of the time in the Mediterranean. So they was training over the big lakes up there. So Lake Huron was chosen because it was very close to it's not Stillwell, it'll come to me, the name of the Army Air Base that was there. Um, so he was going about 100, 300 miles an hour, lost his engine, and of course he went right into the water. And with that engine behind him and all that mass, it just went straight through the cockpit. And Lieutenant Frank Mooley was killed instantly. They found his decapitated body about 2 months later of these young people. So we went up there and we documented the wing section of this aircraft is still pretty much intact. We found the engine, located the engine, the prop of the airplane, and scattered across the lake bed, the lake floor is these ammunitions and these 50 caliber and 35 caliber machine guns and the ammunition that was he had carried. So all that was there. And so we documented that work, and some of those pieces are now being conserved. It's going to be placed into the Tuskegee Airmen Museum up there in Detroit as part of the Wright Museum of the African American Museum. That work is still being done, but Frank Moody's airplane was just one of five. There's four others up there in the lake as well that the state of Michigan is still trying to locate, and hopefully we'll be engaged in some of that work as it going forward. But in was it 22? It was during COVID. I think it was 22, August of 22. We put a memorial marker up there on the lakefront at Port Huron, where the lake empties into St. Clair River, and in most cases, you got a river flowing into the lake, but in this case, water flows out of the lake and forms the St. Clair River. So right
Hmm.
at the confluence and right across the other side is Canada. We put this what's called an obelisk. That's a Greek word, but anyway, an obelisk of solid black granite to memorialize these five airmen that lost their lives in it. prominent on the promenade up there. If you ever go up there, Fort Huron, you can see it. It dominates the promenade. A very beautiful piece.
I think your ceremony also included the surviving Tuskegee Airmen
That's correct.
at that time, correct?
Yep. Colonel Ferguson. He was about to celebrate his 100th birthday while we were up there.
Wow.
Mm.
He made his transition now, but we had a little birthday celebration for him while we were up there for his 100th birthday.
Lovely. Well, as always, our time has flown by.
Oh boy.
But I'm curious as to what you think was your most significant find or work. What's the dive that you participated in that gave you the most, I don't know, satisfaction is not the word I'm looking for, but that meant the most to you.
Sure, yeah, I think I feel you, Michelle. It's all very, very significant and it's all very, very important. I think, I hate to try to rank it because they're all very important. These stories are so critical, each one of them. But what in terms of memory impact is that's the very first dive on the South Jose, Phuket, the Africa, off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. The conditions kind of kept you focused. The water is very cold, about 45 degrees. There's a lot of surge, movement of the water. There's a very sandy bottom. There's a lot of kelp, so you got to be on your game when you enter the water. So that in itself made it sort of memorable, but actually engaging that materiality for that I spoke of earlier was a very powerful moment. And not only that, while I was doing the work, I was working with a young lady who was in a PhD program at the time. Now she's a very powerful paleoanthropologist in South Africa who was doing some incredible work. She's working on a team that found the cave of our ancestors who 300,000 years ago, of course, they wasn't Homo sapiens, but the precursors to humans. 300,000 years ago, they was ritualistically burying their dead. Ritualistically burying their dead in Africa. So they had this transcendent moment. So that was it, Michelle. And what made that so memorable so further is because I discovered a shackle on that dive. And so that made that
Mm.
a very powerful moment because of her. That
Yeah.
archaeologist that I mentioned earlier, she's very playful and she wanted me to go look at something. And when I went over there, we found this shackle.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Wow. Wow. Talk about touching history.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Michelle, just want to interrupt.
Mm.
Kamal, how do the listeners in our audience get to learn a little bit more about Diving with a Purpose, Slave Wrecks Project? Where can they go for this kind of information and learn about a lot of the work that you and National Association of Black Divers and people like that have done?
Sure. Quick answer, Raymond. I just encourage them to go to our website, divingwithapurpose.org, divingwithapurpose.org, all one word, and you can find out about all the work that we're doing across the board, both in the archaeology space and the coral reef restoration space. And you can go to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture site and connect with the slaverexproject.org and found out about the work that we're doing with Slave Rex Project. We partner with other organizations as well, the Society of Black Archaeologists and others, NOAA down in Florida Keys. And we partner with a number of organizations. Slave Rex is just one of several.
Fantastic.
Kamal, we just want to thank you so much. You're probably our most prominent guest we've ever had on the show.
Wow.
And we're so honored and thrilled
And grateful.
and grateful for your time and all your commitment to the work and your loving and searching for our ancestors. It's just it makes me almost speechless. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. We hope that your work will not be disturbed by the current clown
Climate.
show.
Climate.
We can't be distracted. I am very clear. We're very clear on the work that we need to do, It's not about me and all. It's about, reviving the dignity and humanity of our ancestors so we can move forward as powerful human beings. So it's about the work. It's definitely not about me. I just one of the many that's trying to tell these men and stories. But we have to stay focused and don't get distracted by the clown show that you mentioned.
Yeah, perfect words to end on. Thank you again so much for
Thank
coming
you,
on the
Kamau.
show.
Thank you. My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
So, Michelle, I feel like I've just spent the last hour or a little less than an hour in a history class about the, as he puts it, transatlantic era of enslavement. And I've learned so much in this one session with Kamau Siddiqui.
Yeah, I think you can tell from his voice how really important this work is to him, and how it's an emotionally driven kind of work.
Yes.
And I don't know if our listeners appreciate it, but not everybody can hear the ancestors when they call out to them. But he clearly is someone who is gifted enough to hear them calling, to find them, and to help translate their stories and say their names. So it's just such a powerful experience listening to him and watching him on the film Descendants. So I'm so just terribly happy that he agreed to speak to us, and I hope our listeners appreciate it and will go ahead and watch the film.
And we are really very fortunate to have been able to share this time with him, because it took us a few weeks to bring him in the fold. But I think we were very fortunate to have a chance to speak with him and learn a little bit more about how we got here.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. If you like what you heard today, follow us on our website, www.nubiantigerspodcast.com, where you can get additional information about the show. And don't forget to check out our resource pages while you are on the site. You can find our podcast on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers Podcast channel. And we're back on Spotify under Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.